Okay, Jim, you're on.
All right. Well, Mike was born in Victoria and has chosen Victoria as to remain here. Um, from a young age, he knew the office job wasn't for him. And Mike, sorry, my voice is going again. At an early age, um, in grade 6, Mike worked with fellow students as a peer supporter, and in high school continued to be a peer support to students with learning and development disability. Mike is active in sports, air cadets, and was a student leader in a youth group. Not long after high school, Mike met his wife, Julia, and a couple of years later, they were married. And they had their first child, Nathan, who is a paramedic. Since then, Mike went back to school, went to commercial college, received a certification in community support work, and started his career in community supports. For over 16 years, he has worked with children and adults with varying abilities with a focus on autism services. Also, in this time, together with his wife, they spent 5 years fostering parents, focusing on children under 5. One day, 10 years ago, they had a child in their care that joined them when he was 3 days old. The boy never left as he became their second child. Soon after the adoption, their son was diagnosed with autism, ADHD, and sensory processing disorder. Mike and his wife chose to stop fostering children and focus on their child's needs and homeschooling. Currently, Mike is a residence coordinator with Vancouver Island Autistic Homes Society, supervising a group home for adults with autism, and now starting a new program and personnel support together with his executive director. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience from working with children and adults in residential care, day programs, and employment services programs, supporting people with challenges, behavior, and being a parent of a child with autism. Mike is also Paul Harris Fellow, receiving the award from the Royal Oak Rotary Club about 7 years ago. And that's my boy.
Wow, that's great. That's awesome. Taking care of that young child. That's probably where you got most of your experience, right? Or got your incentive to begin to learn.
Actually, no. And it's funny because I'd been in the field, 7-8 years before he came along, and it's actually, I think, just serendipitous that he came into our care with the knowledge and experience that we have. My wife is also a licensed ECE by education as well, so he landed probably in the best place that he could.
Oh, perfect for him.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much, Jim. I see why you're so proud of him. And Michael, the floor is yours, sir.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me. I have really looked forward to spending this time with you and to get some information out there. One of the things that we didn't talk about in that introduction there was that I'm also a pretty strong advocate as well, speaking for people with disabilities, but also promoting rights and knowledge for adults and children with autism. So I got the questions about employment. We can definitely talk about some of those things today. And we can also understand that my perspective is going to be very much focused or driven from a British Columbia point of view. It's the system that I've worked in and know. There are a lot of parallels to Washington and the States, but there's also different legislations, there's different things, and but the statistics for everything are about comparable. So if we say a number in Canada, it is equally true for the United States. So please bear with me. I know Bill and my dad know I was attending to a client crisis earlier just before I logged in here today, and I forgot most of my notes for that at my client's house. So I'm going from memory and the brief little script that I have jotted down at the time that we're here. So autism is a really prevalent thing in North America, and it's getting a lot of traction in media. There's a lot of coverage and happening about its prevalence, and we'll get into some numbers in just a moment, but also the different supports. And as you asked Bill there at the beginning about vaccinations, that has been a really hot button thing for the past several years. So maybe I can start with the numbers and the statistics, because this is actually a pretty, I think, overwhelming bit of knowledge for most people to first hear, and then we can go into the rest here. So in Canada, autism appears approximately in 1 in 66 children. Excuse me. And it presents in boys almost 4 times more frequently than girls. So if we look at that 1 in 66, we break that down, 1 in 42 males will be diagnosed with autism compared to about 165 females. And so there suggests a very strong genetic link to some of these things. If we look over time, the past, say, 16 years or 18 years, the prevalence of autism has increased at a very significant rate. So if we look at 2002, approximately 1 in 155 children would be diagnosed with autism. In 2006, that number goes to 1 in 110. In 2012, 6 years later, that's 188, or sorry, 1 in 88. And then the last stats that were just taken in 2018, officially speaking, is 1 in 66. Although the newest numbers that are coming out are going to forecast around 1 in 53. Now, these numbers are all approximate, and it depends on the studies that you read and the statistics that are taken and the sampling that is done. But I think this is a very accurate representation of what the North American society is.
Michael, question on that. Is part of that, or recognizing an increase or seeing an increase, is part of that because they've identified what I would say, a bigger spectrum or more types of autism across the spectrum?
No, they've actually changed some of the diagnosis terms and what they're calling things. So you may have heard things like Asperger's syndrome as being part of autism. That has actually been dropped out of the this standards manual. So there's a diagnostic standards manual for psychiatric conditions. So that we call it the DSM, and that's where psychologists and doctors have their manual for addressing and identifying different disorders. So several years ago, Asperger's was its own thing, which was at the very high end, high functioning end of the autism spectrum. That has now dropped, and we just now have really autism, which encapsulates the whole spectrum. And then a couple other things have actually dropped off. We used to have a label called PDD-NOS, which stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder, Not Otherwise Specified, which means, hey, there's something here. It really looks like it could be autism or not, but we don't really have a label for it, but we're gonna slip it under the autism umbrella, and you can get autism funding for that. So the PDD-NOS was kind of a catch-all for we don't really know, but here's some funding that you can get with that. And now that no longer exists as we know it. So back to, that was a two-part question too, right?
No, that was just the
No.
one question about, and you've answered that regarding, you know, that certain things have been taken out of the spectrum, and now autism is basically autism, but with some spectrum, right?
That's right. And all the way along, it has been classified as a spectrum disorder. So it is a wide range of things that can be from people that have no verbal communication, that have like the stereotyped repetitive behaviors. They may flap their hands or rock, sing to themselves. Their academic ability is very low, so their learning is delayed, or you won't see them passing school marks. Really hard to measure somebody's IQ though that way, because some people can be, for lack of better description, trapped in their autism. So they have all this knowledge and things that are existing inside, but they haven't found a way to express that. A web video that's relatively older now, that you can find on YouTube, called "In My Language" by Amanda. I'm sorry, I forget her last name right now. Really shines a light on that, where you'll see her engage in the stereotype behaviors of rocking and singing and flapping and stuff. But as soon as she gets a keyboard in her hand and can type things out, then she's just as articulate as I am now, if not more. So that speaks to that one side of the spectrum, and go all the way up and everything in between to the high end, what we used to call Asperger's. Those are people that are able to function in society and in their lives. They can hold jobs, have relationships. You know, they may have some quirks to them. Back in the day, we may have called these people nerds, or you know, locked in computers or in server rooms somewhere. So it's a very broad thing that encapsulates a lot of things. And there's a chain now that goes on that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. That's how unique it is to each individual. Yeah, so I can spend a little bit more time talking about some of the different levels of that as well on the spectrum. I can tell you some things that autism is not, better than I can tell you than what it is. It's not contagious. So you can't catch autism from your neighbor. You're not going to walk into a room and full of people that are autistic and suddenly walk out with autism. It is categorically not caused by vaccinations, and I will touch on that in a little bit, because there's a lot of controversy around that. And it's also not caused by parenting style. So we talk about nature versus nurture, and nurturing has nothing to do with the development or the onset of autism. In fact, you can have families that, you know, are loving parents. They do everything right by whatever book they're going by all of our social norms and standards, and a child will still develop, or could still develop, autism. So the as to what it is and how it excuse me, becomes, there is a lot of studies out there, and no one is 100% sure and can say, hey, this is what causes autism. There's a lot of genetic links going on. One study has suggested that about 466 different genetic markers are present in autism.
Jeez.
Yeah, and in no continuous or replicating pattern.
Can I interject a question here? You talked about developing autism. I mean,
Yep.
Is this something you can be non-autistic at one point, but you develop it?
Well, I say that loosely. It's a good question, and that's based on people's experiences with young children. They say my child grew up and they were developing fine. They, met a bunch of the milestones around the appropriate time and age, but then all of a sudden their language stopped, or all of a sudden they developed this, that, or the other, and then the autism came out. So that's what I say, developing it. So it was probably already there, but something happened in a developmental cycle that it became pronounced, or it revealed itself. We also know that as people age and progress, as hormones change, as their bodies mature, it can affect how their autism can affect them as well. One thing that is out there, and you may have heard of people with savant skills. So, geniuses on the autism spectrum. Some of those skills actually don't stay and remain throughout their lifetime. That after a point in time, those abilities actually start to decline. I've met a few people like that locally that, one actually I went to school with, he's amazing with numbers. I'd love to take him down to Vegas. He could track about 7 decks of cards all at once, and also many other things. But as he's aged and now talking with him now, that ability is just not there like it was.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of stereotypes that go with it. And that's why, like, this opportunity is great for me to present some information to you. Back to what or where autism can come from. And we talked about the genetics a little bit. There's also some studies that find that diet may have an impact on the development or onset of autism. So there is studies looking at the connection between the intestines or bowels and the gut-brain connection. There's also studies looking at gluten as a possibility of having an impact, but I don't really think that they're zeroing in as on a cause. And again, if we look at the numbers and the statistics, that the prevalence is so much higher in males than females, it begs the question, what's going on here? Like, why is it impacting boys more than girls? So unfortunately, there is no root cause, this is what it is, or this is what you can do, this is how we can prevent it. If we look at the prevalence, and why some of those numbers the statistics are changing so rapidly, one of the things is that we have better diagnostic tools. We've learned more about autism and its symptoms. We've learned to recognize it in earlier ages. We also have a few different phenomena going on that no one can actually explain why in North America it has a higher rate than, say, some of the Eastern Europe countries. So one factor may be, and a bit of this is my own observation, that we talked about geeks and that just a moment ago, that, people like in the early days, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, founders of Silicon Valley, who would be introverted, have some real social quirks, but really good with numbers or logistics or concrete processing. More and as society has developed and we've got better understanding of autism, more and more people are actually having relationships, and people that would be shut-ins and nerds or whatever you want to classify those people are now in this age coding for big software companies. They're in Fortune 500 companies or other things in higher levels, successful, and now entering relationships. The idiosyncrasies aren't as big as what they were a few decades ago. So with that, expect that if there's that component to it, that it's going to be passed around a lot more. And again, just a theory. the science is still out there. So back to science and the vaccine question. That came about in the late 90s, where one doctor did a very finite study based on about 12 children, looking at, I'm just gonna pull up some notes here, looking at the measles, mumps, rubella virus and the digestive system in children that exhibited autism symptoms. So this is back in 1998. It was Dr. Andrew Wakefield in the UK, along with 12 co-authors that did that. After his study, he recommended that the MMR vaccine be suspended in favor of a single antigen vaccination given separately over time. So it would be one vaccine for each thing, one for measles, one for mumps, one for rubella, and then staggered over time. What wasn't apparent at that time is that Wakefield himself had also filed for a patent for a single antigen measles vaccine in 1997. So there's the potential for him to actually profit from promoting that as well. But back then, the reaction to his claim was immediate and profound, and it hit the news quite quickly. And this is just as the internet was emerging as well, so the information was getting out there fast. And right, I think in that time, parents were becoming frightened. There's, hey, this doctor did a study, and it looks like MMRs are causing autism. But the next 12 years, the possibility of that link was studied exhaustively, and no reputable relevant study confirmed Wakefield's findings. Instead, many well-designed studies have found no link between measles, mumps, rubella vaccinations and bowel disease, or MMR and autism. So flash forward a few years, in January 2011, another reporter, Brian Deere, spoke with Wakefield, and for his report, Deere spoke with parents of the children from the retracted study and found evidence that Wakefield committed research fraud by falsifying data on the children's conditions. So the follow-up from this is that the study was flawed. Wakefield actually falsified a lot of the findings and manipulated the study conditions. And the long-term effect for him was that he was actually had his license to practice medicine in the UK was revoked. There is several lawsuits that went underway, and I believe there might still be one or two still open or coming to a conclusion. So he's effectively been discredited in the medical field. The study has been debunked, and several better studies with thousands of participants rather than dozens have, I think, irrefutably proven that vaccinations do not cause autism. There is no link, which is great, but the traction from that media coverage has taken hold, and we're now in a social climate where we have alternate news as a thing, we have conspiracy theories as a thing, and we have now climate deniers and all these things that intelligent people, for whatever the reasons, are not accepting empirical proof from the science community. And they have a voice because the internet, and sometimes that voice is louder than what truth can bring.
So Michael, following up on that, are there some resources out there that we could look at, such as those other studies, you know, that we could point people to if they want to argue with us about vaccinations? We can say, take a look at these studies, not obviously not Wakefield's.
For sure, yeah. And honestly, I actually had a list of those resources that is now with my client at their house. So if you don't mind, maybe I can email you a list of resources.
Email it to your dad and he can get it to me. That'd probably
For
be
sure.
the easiest link.
Okay.
Okay.
But definitely looking at Google, through Google, and looking for reputable sites like Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, PubMed, things like that. And looking for sources that actually cite that have citations for their sources of information too, is really important. And that those citations don't include things like the National Enquirer, but and then also looking at studies that were done actually outside of North America and in Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, can we go back to a point you were talking about? You said diet and things like that might have some impact. Can you actually treat autism and by manipulating diet or doing other things so that maybe the symptoms are less?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So yes, and it again, everything is person specific. So we may look at one thing for one person and it absolutely works, and we try it for the next person and it doesn't. So not to mean that it's false or doesn't work, it just means it's not the right approach for that person. But yeah, so things like I said, gluten is one thing that people have really looked at, and wheat-based things. Some people look at restricting dairy as well. And preservatives are the three big things that people will look at right now, diet-wise, that can have an impact on helping with some of the symptoms. And that may be with general mood, and it may not actually be the autism per se. It could be something like irritable bowel syndrome or something like that, but is exacerbated by the autistic condition. Excuse me. So connecting with a doctor and being willing to do some trial and error and record, take data. We tried this on this day. We tried it for so many days. It didn't work. Now we tried this. The more that you can look for those patterns, the better you'll be at finding a solution or something that may help a specific individual. Another key too is early intervention as well. So if we can get a diagnosis or get an understanding that autism is present at the younger age, the better, because there's more work that we can do. And children are malleable; they want to learn, and we can work with that as well. And there's different strategies and techniques. I'll be quite open right now that I do have a bias against some things being done as a holistic or as the de facto treatment. So things like applied behavior analysis. That is one means. It's looking at behaviors and targeting them, and it's using a reward or reinforcement method of working through different behaviors or different things. So at the highest level, you look to either reward or reinforce the behaviors you want, and you don't reward or reinforce the things that you don't want. So things like if someone is aggressive, we don't want aggressive behavior per se. We need to help a child find another way to communicate whatever that is driving that aggression. So it's looking for things like that. And so if they slap a wall, they don't get reinforced for slapping the wall. But if they tap somebody's hand and say, I'm hungry or I am hurting or something, then they get praise or rewards or things like that. So over time, the desired behavior is rewarded and the other one goes away. There's other approaches like a relational developmental approach, which essentially is meeting a child wherever they are at with their autism and working alongside them, taking their processes, their wants, wishes, desires, and working with that and still steering them towards maybe things like socially appropriate behavior, like not saying hi to everybody on the street or walking into the playground and, hey, everybody, let's play tag, or whatever it is. Or It could be finite obsession with things. So that's one of the symptoms of autism is a hyper focus on specific things or a high interest to them, with maybe not really regarding other people's lack of interest in that. So they can be really focused on, say, cars, and it could be toy cars, model cars, hot rods, whatever, but they live, eat, breathe cars. And so, you know, if we're looking at an ABA approach or the applied behavior analysis approach, that, you know, every time that they would talk about cars that was at an inappropriate time or an inappropriate way, then there would be some consequence. So it'd either be ignored or there wouldn't be reinforced. But if they talked about cars in an appropriate way, that would be reinforced and rewarded. If we take that example into the relationship model, then people are talking about cars. Oh yeah, what do you like about cars? Why is that fascinating to you? I like cars too. And okay, well, maybe we can talk about cars this other way. So we're not immediately, I don't want to say shutting down or ignoring, but we're acknowledging the communication. We're affirming what this person is experiencing and what they're liking, and we're working with that and moving towards appropriate ways to express that want or desire and things like that. And that can be with anything too. So if there's the aggressive behaviors, you know, a relationship model would look at, you know, really what's the communication that this is trying to convey. So it could be a lack of expressive skills, or a child doesn't have verbal communication at this point in time, so they punch themselves in the head every time a bright light shines in their eyes. They're communicating, well, that light is really bright and it hurts me, but they can't tell you that. So working with that, you find ways to, you walk into a dark room and the kid is happy. You walk into a really bright room or a suddenly bright room, and the child loses their ability to focus or becomes aggressive or has what we would call a freak out. And looking for those patterns, like, okay, well, if we walk into a room, we'll make sure that the lights are low, and then we'll slowly bring them up, or things like that. And then there's a combination of everything in between. So I think at younger ages, if we can find systems that incorporate as many tools as we can, some of it ABA, a lot of it relationship, because we really want to meet people where they are at, because at the end of the day, they're people just like you and I. They have the same wants, wishes, desires, and they want to be heard and things too. So meet at a personal level, and then all these other tools can really help someone with their autism. So other characteristics about autism that many people may not be aware of is a sensory processing component to that. So that's things like touch, taste, smell. I just, in my example there, mentions sight or vision. So some people are photosensitive, so bright lights and things happening affect them, and they're hypersensitive to that. Other people are not. Same with sound. Some people are really affected by even the smallest hum in the room. It could be a really grating, hard experience for them, where others, they can walk through a room with a jackhammer and not even be aware that it's occurring. We have people that are sensitive to touch, so they're hypersensitive. So even the lightest touch can be distressing to them. So it can give a sensation of pain or displeasure. And other people are hyposensitive. So a light brush they wouldn't even acknowledge, but they seek out like deep pressure. And if you've heard about Temple Grandin and her hug machine or her squeeze machine, that tight stuff helps people focus and what we would say be present to the here and now. So in space and time, that sense of pressure helps them reorientate to, what am I doing in this moment? This is who I am. This is what I'm doing, and this is how I need to be. And without that, they can be lost and I don't know what to do. I don't know who I am. What do I do? there has been reports from people that their sensory system is wired completely different than ours, and they can actually taste pain, and pain to them makes them feel like throwing up or leaves a sour taste in the mouth. Or can be inverse where tickles hurt. So these are all sensory related things that when somebody on the spectrum, you see them biting their hands or flapping or doing some of those things, you hear a label of a self-stimming or a stimming behavior. It's a self-stimulation. What that actually may be is them helping themselves regulate with a stressor in their environment. So biting their hand is creating a sense of pressure that again helps them reorientate to the here and now. That rocking can be a very soothing motion. And if you look at neurotypical people or people without autism, we sit in rocking chairs and we rock and we like that feeling. We have special chairs that give us massages and we buy these things. So not that different from somebody on the spectrum, it's just their experience is much more pronounced. And that's another thing about autism, is that really it's, from my observation and experience, it's just a hyper acceleration of the human condition. We all tend to like routine and sameness. That's why we wear our watches on the same wrist. We put our wallets in the same back pocket or the same pocket. We wear our purses over the same shoulder. We have these tendencies for routine. We have things that we're comfortable with. I'm very open about, I don't like white noise. Fans, dishwashers, dryers drive me nuts. I need other noise going on, but I am able to manage and recognize that this is bothering me, and I can do something for myself to manage that. Whereas a person on the autism spectrum may not be able to do that. They may not be able to recognize what the stressor is, or they can know this is bugging me, but what do I do? Oftentimes anxiety occurs with autism too. So people with autism also usually have a higher anxiety state, or can also be bad enough that they have it as a separate diagnosis. And on that point, the person that I was working with tonight is a high functioning person with autism. They've allowed me to share a little bit about this. They actually have a degree in psychology. They speak over 7 languages. They are quite proficient at doing certain things, but they're quite dependent on other areas. But in this person's studies with psychology and as it relates to autism, she wanted me to pass on to you folks that there's studies out there about a part of the brain, and forgive me, I just got this information today, I forget the region of the brain, but I'll look it up and I will add it into the links for the resources. It suggests that almost everyone assessed with autism has the state of being with their brain that puts them almost in a perpetual fight or flight mode. So every experience that they have, and they're in this heightened awareness state that has them in that condition, which can be distressing. And if we can imagine, if we're in that place where every experience coming to us is a life or death potential moment, and do I run away from this or do I stop and fight this, that can have a significant impact on somebody's life. Whereas people like you and I'm going to use the term neurotypical, so people with typical developmental growth and in a neuro or brain pattern way, we don't experience that. So it's hard for us to even fathom what that anxiety or that feeling could be. And that's why too, we may see people demonstrate these odd behaviors or aggressive or socially disruptive behaviors. So that's right from the source. And I should have also qualified at the beginning too, and I apologize that today I'm speaking from a non-autistic point of view. So all the information I have is because I've been in this environment. Yes, my son has autism, but I don't have it. So I'm going from education, talking with self-advocates, and information that they've been passed on in all these studies. But again, you know, I'm doing the best that I can without actually having myself.
Terrific. Question. It's
Yeah.
funny how things from years ago now are coming back to me. When I was in college, I took a psychology course, right? And there was a movie when David, I think it was when David Loves Julie or David and Julie. It's an old black and white film, but I never thought about it until what you just talked about. He had developed a relationship, David did, and his girlfriend wanted to get closer. And so mentally, they were fine, right?
Yep.
And he was under counseling, but part of the core focus of this movie was she made a critical mistake in the relationship and she touched him. And he lost it. And what it was the course of the movie was bringing him back. And then bringing her to a point where she had to accept that the relationship, at least for that particular time, did not involve touching. But now that you talked about it, back then they didn't know it, but now that was autism.
Mm-hmm. Quite
Wow.
possibly, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Yep. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen Big Bang Theory on TV. Yeah. And Jim Parsons, who plays Sheldon Cooper on the show, does a fantastic job of portraying someone that really could be classified as someone on the spectrum at the Asperger's end. There's several key points in that show that, you know, as a parent, as a worker in this field, it really struck a chord with me when he starts to talk to Penny about some of things that are hard for him. And kudos to the writers for encapsulating that, because it really spoke to an autistic moment where one that I'm really focused on is when the two are talking about things that are interesting to them. They're sitting on the couch in the living room, and Sheldon wanted to talk about web browsers, and he was quickly dismissed by Penny because all this geek talk. But Sheldon says, you know, this hurts me. You want to talk and learn about me, but these are the things that are of interest to me. They may not interest you, but I find it very distressing when this browser changed to da 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 da. And that is another classic moment. And that show actually had several things like that, where if you look at it through the lens that person may have autism, and from a non-autistic point of view, it's like, wow, okay, that makes sense now. And with that understanding can bring empathy. And if you watch the whole relationship arc between Sheldon and Amy, you know, it kind of parallels what you were just saying too. And it's very much the case where with social understanding, and we're coming to know so much more that a person with autism is no different really than you and I. We have wishes, desires, needs. Just some of those things are fulfilled in different ways. And another stereotype is that a person with autism is disinterested, or is what's the word? Oh,
good doctor. Yeah.
Yeah. Disconnect. We'll say disconnected.
Not focused.
Indifference. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay. Is indifferent to things and relationships, which there may be some people that are like that, but that's also true for neurotypical people. The difference is what an autistic individual might project is in that disinterest or indifference is that they've removed themselves. They're not making eye contact. They're not socially interacting like you and I are right now, which doesn't mean that they're not interested. It does suggest that there is something that is either not comfortable for them, or that they're processing the information in a completely different way. So that some people, eye contact hurts. It is, and it may not be a physical pain, but it it's painful or it's very, very hard, and they can only sustain it for a moment and then they have to look away. I think one of the biggest things that we can do as society and as parents is force our children or force people to make eye contact with us. And I'm saying that because if you really look at what's going on, we're asking them to make something comfortable for us. It's about our needs, not theirs. We're not comfortable with them not looking at us. And that shows an intolerance, in my opinion. So we're asking them to do something that they physically can't do for a long period of time. We're asking them to conform to us when really it could be the other way around. That, you know, what does it matter? As long as they're engaged, you get answers to your questions, you know, you have a dialogue back and forth, or the exchange or communication is meaningful. What does it matter? And I really have found in my...
Sorry, we're brought up not to trust people who don't look us in the eye. I think that's
right. Look at me when I talk to you, young man.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very, very old school way of doing things. And if you look at that, and that actually drives a wedge between caregivers, parents, and children or other people, because you're asking them to do something that is uncomfortable for them. And why would I trust you if you're asking me to do something that I can't really do? Or it's so hard for me that I can only manage it for a moment, and I'm not giving you what you're wanting anyways because I can't attend to the conversation or what you're wanting. And professionally, I think that is one of the biggest things that I've made inroads in with the people that I've supported. I've never demanded that from people, and I've actually had 2 individuals in my career tell me that I'm the first person that has actually never asked them to look at them. And that was a pretty impactful statement to me. And it means that, you know, I think I'm on the right track, especially when with self-advocates that say, you know, like this is the way it goes. And I encourage people to assess themselves, and when we're having those interactions, especially when we know or suspect that someone might be on the spectrum, that when we're asking something from them, whose needs are being met? Is it something for us, or is it something for them, or is it something shared between us?
You know, Michael, my grandson plays Special Olympics basketball, and I'm not with him tonight, so my wife took him because I'm here. But there's a young man on his team with autism, and he will stand there and not move at all. But if you go over and hand him the ball, then he will take it down and shoot. You can't talk to him, you can't coach him, you can't throw the ball to him. But if you hand it to him, he'll participate and he's on the autism spectrum. And when he's uncomfortable, his mother is the assistant coach. He'll walk over and stand with her for a period of time. And then she'll take him, put him back on the court. And then he'll, again, stand there until somebody gives him the ball. Very, very interesting. I'm going to watch him a lot more now after this presentation.
And it sounds like that is a very inclusive team too. So they've recognized, okay, here's how he can participate. So let's support that. Let him do the best that he can, and that he's not the next Michael Jordan or whatever. Who cares, right? Like he's happy, the team's happy. It sounds like a very wonderful place to be.
It's fun to watch all the children with all their children, they're all adults with their disabilities, and how the coaches who are experienced deal with each of those. So yeah.
And that's actually a really good example for things that a lot of people tend to have things that they can do quite well and are very strong at, and other things that they require a lot of support or assistance with. And it's all over the place. So some person can look like they are managing their day, and that they get up and they have their breakfast and they do whatever it is, and then they go off to whatever activity or job or whatever it is, and they look like they're leading a pretty functional life. But what we don't see is sometimes what's happening in the background to make that possible. So there was a parent, or there was a caregiver or a support worker that made sure that their shoes were lined up in the right way, that they got them on, and that, you know, the breakfast was served in a certain way, and then they got on the right bus, or the handy dart got there and they got onto their ride and they made it to, so we call those functional supports. So a person can, by optics, appear quite together and capable of many things, but they're functionally dependent to be that. And the example that, actually I'll give you a resource right now to Dr. Nathan Ori. Nathan Ori. He was a psychologist here in Victoria, BC. He is now traveling and doing an information circuit, and you can find him participating on Autism Today. He shared a story with me, or with us, during a training session, that there is a boy that he knew, and he didn't say where, that as long as he had the finger of a caregiver on his shoulder, someone touching him, he was able to do anything and everything. Absence of that presence of the finger and that pressure from that one person, fell apart and couldn't do anything, couldn't even tie his own shoe. So again, it kind of speaks to, people are capable of lots when they have the supports that they require. And so, we talk about things called props and roles in what we do, especially more as children get older and become adults. Sometimes people don't know how to be or who to be in a social context. So it could be at a party. But if you hand someone a spatula or a flipper and have them at a barbecue, and your job is to flip burgers, and they sit there and they flip burgers and they're carrying on conversation, oh, thank you for the burger, and yeah, or do you watch sports? And they're able to communicate and do things through that action of flipping burgers. Well, the prop was the spatula or the flipper, and the role was flipping burgers, but all this other stuff came out of that. So we can extend that too for other things, that we can give somebody a prop and a role and how to be in a certain environment or context. And it's limitless. It's, again, just finding what is meaningful to the individual and what works. And the key is meaningful. Like, it just can't be something arbitrarily, and we're going to move this pile of rocks from spot A and move it over to spot B and then move it back to A again.
Wow. So we're getting close to the end, Michael. This has been fantastic. So two things I want to ask. Number one, do you have any final thing or message you would like to get to us? And then after that, go around and see if anyone has any questions that they've been holding back on. So first, sure. Michael, any last messages you'd like to leave us with?
Well, one is, we've talked about all of this stuff, but we didn't really get into the support environment and the structure. And I'm sure this is true in Washington and the states on whole, as it is here in BC and the rest of Canada. Funding for what we do as support workers is very limited, and it seems to be declining. We had a period of time in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we had this really big push for community living and community act. That wave seems to have crested now. And what gets lost is there's a high focus on children with autism and special needs, but those children grow to be adults. And that funding drops exponentially as soon as somebody hits 19. And then if we look more locally to Victoria, our city is one of the highest cost of living cities in Canada. And then we also look at the price of just the cost of housing and properties. And we look at how small the city is and resources. It becomes really hard and challenging to create new resources and just be able to expand services. Through other Rotary clubs, we've benefited from grants before, and it's people like you and your grants or donations that really help nonprofits move along. So without that, we kind of get stuck at times. And then also there's a big push for privatization as well. With children specifically, we have a lot of big companies that get paid a lot of dollars from specific funding that parents get, but they may not be getting the value for what they're paying for. So an example is that we have in BC what are workers called BIs, or behavior interventionists. These are the frontline workers that are doing the intervention work with children on the autism spectrum. Companies are charging about $30 an hour for that. But this is a dysregulated group of support workers. There's no oversight for them. There's no certifying board or body that they belong to. In fact, any kid over the age of 19, Sally Jane down the street, we can slap a BI label on her and in theory make $30 an hour. What is happening with some of these companies is that they're charging parents $30 an hour out of their funding that they get. They're paying their workers $10, $12, $15, $16 an hour, and the rest goes into the private pockets. So the parents aren't getting the value that we think we're getting.
There's no government oversight of that? I mean, there's no standard they must follow or anything? No certification?
No, so not for the workers. Now, the workers are working under, or should be working under the supervision of what we call behavior consultants or behavior analysts, who have gone through 4, 5, 6 years of university studies. And they belong to a certifying agency, the BCAC. But the actual workers, they don't. And I've actually had conversations with the director for the Ministry of Children and Family Development here in BC. We had an incident with our son, and it is recognized that these workers actually don't have a professional association. Now, in contrast, if we look at the adult world, especially with retirement living and assisted living, like in hospitals and care homes, we have what are called HCAs, or healthcare assistants. And they have different labels as well, or RCAs, residential care attendants. But they actually have an attendant registry that they have to register with to be able to work in BC in that role.
But not with children.
But not with the children.
Wow. Well, so I'm going to open this up. Anyone in the group have any questions for Michael that have not been asked yet, or maybe have and you didn't hear it? Everybody? Anybody?
Well, did we talk about the resources for young adults for employment? I wasn't quite sure. We talked about the potential skill sets they have, but how to get into the market. Has Canada have some resources related to that? I know in Washington State, for instance, when I used to work at Microsoft, there was a special focus of bringing special talent in because of two things. Not only were they maybe good coders, but since we were also addressing that audience, we were also developing code for that audience. Is there anything that does that similar for the, let's say, in Canada?
Yeah, so we, here in Canada, I think it's the same kind of in North America, that we do have champions for people with special needs, whether it be autism, Down syndrome, Tourette's, or whatever, that we have employers that are actively either hiring people into existing jobs or sometimes creating specific jobs within their place of employment for those people. The term that we use in the industry is called job carving. So they carve out something that may not exist. In BC, some of these things are really regulated, and it comes down to funding. So this comes through our Crown Corporation called Community Living British Columbia. So you need to have a certain level of funding or need. You have to be receiving supports or a benefit through them, and they there's agencies, and I actually worked for one, that actually go out and try and find and work at employing people that have a disability, whether it be in a traditional grocery store setting. And I have one that I worked with that worked at a Home Depot, and he was driving forklifts and doing a whole bunch of stuff. Actually, on the spectrum. To other things where we have, pardon me? Okay. We actually in Victoria have 3 champions that are like that: Starbucks, University of Victoria, and Thrifty's Foods, which is now part of Sobeys. And they have hired a lot of people with disabilities in traditional roles, but also carved out roles as well. So Starbucks here have what they have called cafe attendants, which is a person with a disability that goes around and cleans front of the house. They wipe down the tables, take things in. They may have some other things like washing dishes in the back, but they're there to help keep the store looking presentable to their clientele. As for trying to get into employment, I mean, it's so personal and individualized, and it's a very tough nut to crack, honestly. And part of why I'm not doing that anymore is I felt more like a salesman, and I'm trying to sell people than an actual support worker. And like, hey, I got this guy, he can do this, and what do you got? And it was I would have better luck selling cars than trying to find some people jobs. And that was really disheartening for me. Yeah. But really, it's looking at the strengths that an individual has. And if you don't have people that are registered with an agency, it doesn't stop people from going out and doing things for themselves too. Like, hey, I can do this, or I can do that. In my current agency years ago, through a restaurant connection out in North Saanich, client was a customer there all the time, and through a very dedicated worker managed to get him a job bussing tables, and he negotiated his own payment, and it was a free lunch and a root beer.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that was meaningful to him. Honestly, that filled his cup. He looked so forward to that day for his, and so we need to kind of get out of these mindset sometimes that pay needs to be financial. And yes, you know, if someone's doing a fair job, they need to be fairly compensated, and I'm not arguing against that. But when we look at non-traditional things and different things that, you know, reimbursement is also what is of value to us. You know, like, I do this job not necessarily for the paycheck I get, because honestly, I'm not paid that well compared to teachers or special education assistants in the schools and people that work with children. But I do it because I'm committed, I have a passion for this, and my reward is actually working with the people and getting that hug or the high five, the smile, or knowing that I've made a difference. And the same is also true for somebody with a disability, that we need to look at those things too, and just pound down doors. Don't take no for an answer.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Thank you very much for
Louise? Okay,
the
good.
information.
Good. Anyone else have any more questions for Michael? He's given us, boy, a full hour plus. Any other questions for Michael before we say thank you and good night? Okay, I'm not seeing any more. Last comment to you, Michael, is that I worked on a board down here for 9 years. I served on the board of what's called Morningside Industries, specifically designed to find employment for persons with disabilities. And everything you've said has struck home. I went out on sites, trying to job carve, trying to find employment for people. And one final story, a young man that we got him a job working for the state of Washington in the mail room. And his job was to sort and put them in the slots for delivery. Completely unsatisfied. So they said, what do you want? He ended up going to work for McDonald's, because while he did the same thing, clean tables and all that, he wanted the free lunch he got. He got a free hamburger and fries every day when he went to work and cleaned the tables. Plus, he got some pay as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right on.
That was his motivator. Yeah.
Yep. And then we find that, and that's our door into many places.
Yeah.
Bill, I will put out, if someone does think of something afterwards, if they want to email the question through my dad and send it to me, I'm more than happy to look at it and try and answer it as best I can.
Okay.